Good morning, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner, Head of Collections at the Library of Michigan, here with the Michigan Notable Books Program 2021, our virtual conversations today with the esteemed author, Karen Dionne. Good morning, Karen. How are you?
Good morning, Tim. I'm well, thank you.
Good. And just to let you know, Karen today is speaking outside her local public library, which is always a good thing for us here at the Library of Michigan. We're here to talk about her 2021 book, The Wicked Sister, plus some news about a past notable book. And with that, good morning, Karen. How are you today?
Good morning. And, thankfully it's a beautiful day, no rain, nice weather, nice sunshine, just the way I like it.
Fantastic. And so, Karen, I start off every conversation with every author just asking, how did you become a writer? And basically, what's your background and what led up to this point where you're basically writing critically acclaimed books?
I love this question because, it's kind of like touches on the highlights of one's life journey. And so I won creative writing awards when I was in high school, which was quite some while ago. My 50th high school reunion is coming up this fall, to give you an
Ah,
idea.
congrats.
And but I didn't pursue writing during all those years. I did other creative things, stained glass, fiber arts, and my husband and I moved as a young couple to the Upper Peninsula, where we homesteaded and we built a little cabin. So always I was doing something creative. But when my son was in high school, we were living in St. Ignace. He's a talented writer, and I was encouraging him to enter the same contests I had done well in, the
Oh,
Scholastic Art and Writing Awards. He did do well. As it happened that year, it was the contest's 75th anniversary, and the awards ceremony was at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C.
wow.
Kathy Bates was the master of ceremonies. Frank McCourt was the keynote speaker. And I was like, we are going. And so I think that's where I got the writing bug for myself. It was a classic, I don't want to say midlife crisis, but, my thoughts to myself was, well, what about me? I used to be a pretty good writer.
Yeah.
So I started writing short stories for about a year just to get the creative juices flowing again. And then I wrote a novel. That novel has never been published, but it did get me my literary agent, who I am still with him after 20 some years. My next two novels were science-based thrillers similar to what Michael Crichton writes, because that's at the time, that's what I like to read. And they were published by Berkeley. So, but they were published in mass market paperback size. They were in grocery stores, drugstores, super exciting, obviously, for an author.
Fantastic. Yeah.
But that part of my career didn't really go anywhere, kind of petered off. And then I got the idea for what turned out to be my breakout book, The Marsh King's Daughter.
Mhm.
And that took me into the arena of psychological suspense, which I think I should have been writing all along, because it plays to my writing strengths. So, my advice to aspiring writers is always, if your career isn't going the way you would like it to, maybe you're having trouble getting an agent, or you're stuck in the mid list, try writing something different, because maybe what you started writing isn't what you're especially good at.
Oh my
So,
God.
but that was roughly a 20-year journey from,
That
starting to write seriously to where I am today.
That is fantastic. Okay, so I have so many questions for you now. And so we're going to totally go off script. So
That
Karen,
works.
so Frank McCourt. Okay, so you started writing seriously again sometime in what, the mid to late 90s, and if Frank McCourt was at the Kennedy Center, right?
That's right. That's right. I got my literary agent in 1999. So yeah. Uh-huh.
And so your earlier writing, going back to when you first won the award, back probably 20 years previous to that, maybe even. What were you writing then? What kind of stories were you writing? Was it poetry? Was it nonfiction? What were you writing way back then?
It's hard to remember. Not poetry. I'm still not a poet. I love beautiful words, and I like to think that the parts of my writing border on poetry.
Okay.
But I just, yeah, poetry isn't my strong suit. So probably just whatever school assignments there were.
Okay.
As I've reconnected with some of the people I went to school with, they said, "Oh, you were always such a great writer. I'm not surprised you're writing now." So it's just kind of interesting. I do have some of my writing. My mother saved them. Thank goodness for mothers saving kids' work. I should go back and read them.
Oh, that's fantastic. And then, okay, so then, jump forward, you start writing these mass market paperbacks that are in the supermarkets and drugstores and such like that. I mean, uh, like, to be frank, I didn't even know you were writing that at that time. So What, I mean, what were these stories based upon, and did they have any relevance to what you're writing now for psychological thrillers?
Well, I do think that's interesting because my first published novel is called Freezing Point, and it's set in Antarctica. I wrote it when I was living in St. Ignace, and I joke, I can write about ice and snow and cold, right?
Right.
And it was tagged as an environmental thriller because it has a strong environmental theme. I actually submitted it to the Michigan Notable Books program and it wasn't recognized. So,
Okay.
that tells you where it fell. It was a good book. It sold, it did well, but it wasn't of the caliber that would make it stand out, as part of the Michigan Notable Book program. And then
Okay.
the next book was called, it was set at Chichen Volcano in northern Patagonia, Chile, where I actually went for research, which was one of the coolest things a writer can ever do is go to some exotic place for research. And I used the volcanic eruption at Chichen Volcano as the setting for the book. So I was there a year after the volcano erupted. It was still on red alert. There were, like 25 or so small earthquakes in the vicinity of the volcano that day. I found an English speaking guide who arranged lodging for me in the town, and he took me to the newly formed dome of the
Hmm.
volcano. Like I say, super cool. But that book, and so that was also an environmental thriller. But publishing is a business. It did not do as well as Freezing Point, and that was the end of my string of environmental thrillers. It was called Boiling Point, by the way, because of course.
Of course. So, it leads to the next question, like, why do you write? I mean, you had this epiphany when your son entered the program 20 some years ago. What is this need, and what are you trying to get out? Is it even that, or even like how do the ideas come to you? Let's, all that together.
Yeah, I've given this some thought. I think writing is all about communication. Whether you're writing an email to someone or you're writing, nonfiction or you're writing fiction, it's about taking, the ideas that are in one person's head and, conveying that idea to another. And with fiction especially, I believe fiction is primarily entertainment, and then below the entertainment level, I like to, write something that's meaningful, something that resonates with people, makes them think, what would I do if I was in that situation? Or, the kind of book that sticks with people for a while. I
Sure.
adore fiction. And so, that's how I came to writing fiction. So I think that's why I write. I want to communicate with readers.
So, it leads to the next question for me is, how often and quite frankly, how do you come up with the ideas? I mean, are you just sitting there and suddenly like, I'm going to write about that? I mean, like, seriously, like, are you staring at a tree and it suddenly just enters your head? Like, what happens?
Pretty much that. So, the Marsh King's Daughter, I woke up in the night with the first sentences of the book fully formed in my head. I wasn't dreaming about the character, the sentences were just there. And the
Uh-huh.
sentences are, if I told you my mother's name, you'd recognize it right away. My mother was famous, though she never wanted to be. Hers wasn't the kind of name anyone would wish for. J.C. Dugard, Amanda Berry, Elizabeth Smart, that kind of thing, though my mother was none of them. That was just poof in my head.
Right, right, right.
and and so it intrigued me because I thought, well, this is interesting. So this character is the daughter of a kidnapped girl and the man who took her. And in the morning, it still looked like a good idea. So I wrote up a few more paragraphs in the character's voice, basically her telling me more about herself. And that's now the first page of the novel. So
Wow.
sometimes it's just complete inspiration like that. In the case of The Wicked Sister, my publisher Putnam bought two books from me, and I had no idea what the second book was going to be. So, when it came time to when the dust settled and we got the Marsh King's Daughter edited and where we wanted it to be, and it was time to start on the next book of the contract, yeah, no idea whatsoever. But I knew that I wanted The Wicked Sister to share certain things with the Marsh King's Daughter. The Marsh King's Daughter has a strong fairy tale element. In fact, the story set in the past parallels the fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, The Marsh King's Daughter.
Hmm.
So I actually looked at fairy tales to see if there was another like that would inspire me. And there wasn't, which is just as well because I don't want to make like a clone of the book. I don't want.
Right.
It's one thing to write a follow-up book that readers of the first book will enjoy, but I wanted it to be different. So The Wicked Sister has a lot of fairy tale elements in it. It touches on a lot of fairy tales. It's about two sisters who they grow up in a gorgeous log cabin, hunting lodge, over the top, beautiful, on 4,000 pristine acres of wilderness southeast of Marquette. And I always tell people, you know, the book is fiction because there are no 4,000 pristine acres of wilderness, and probably nowhere in Michigan, let alone in the Upper Peninsula, because of
Right.
logging.
Right.
But I'm postulating that Rachel is her name. Her great great grandfather was one of the timber barons, and he set this parcel of property aside for himself. So, and when Rachel's there, she and her sister and her mother and father, her parents are wildlife biologists. So she studies her parents, backing up, her father studies amphibians, her mother studies black bears. So
Okay.
she grows up even feeling a special affinity for black bears, that she thinks she can communicate with them on a deeper, almost a spiritual level. And this is the opposite. You know, she's like the anti-Helena from the Marsh King's Daughter, because if Helena saw a black bear, her family lives off the grid, she would shoot it and eat it. So you know, in some respects, getting the idea for the Wicked Sister was looking at what was in the Marsh King's Daughter and, you know, turning it on its head.
Okay.
But I do think it shares a lot of themes with the Marsh King's Daughter, in that both protagonists in both books, they have something tragic in their past that they have to overcome as an adult. In the case of Rachel and the Wicked Sister, the book doesn't open with her happily following her parents around in the woods. Instead, she's in a mental institution, and she's been there for 15 years because she believes that she's responsible for the terrible shooting accident that took both her parents' lives when she was 11.
Sure.
So obviously that's the thing that she has to get past. And so I like to think of them, even though they're, you know, considered psychological suspense, some people read them as thrillers, that they have a deeper, more powerful meaning, you know, and they're stories of redemption in a way, you know, or overcoming, not being defined by the bad thing that happened in your past to make something out of yourself.
So again, a bunch of questions, and I don't know if I'm going to remember them all hearing you talk, but so go back to Marsh King's Daughter. So you said I believe that's the book. You said you were asleep, you woke up, and you had a couple of the sentences fully formed in your mind when you woke up. Did you know when you woke up this is going to be a psychological suspense? And what is it about that genre? Because I mean, obviously this is something that's working for you. What is it about that you know works for Karen Dionne? Does that
Yeah,
make sense? That's what I'm
it
asking.
does.
I mean,
Yeah, that's a great question. I did not wake up thinking, oh, this is going to be a psychological suspense. In fact, I didn't even know if the book was going to be a thriller, but I was so taken by this character, I wanted to tell her story.
sure.
And as far as the psychological aspect, I've always been fascinated by why people do what they do. Why did I say or think that? Why did I react that way? Why did you react that way? You know, and that shows up even in my early books too. So, you know, that part of it was natural for me. And then I think the suspense element comes in because I'm very easily bored. And you know, I sometimes say musically, string quartet, no. And I used to play violin in high school, but string quartet, no. You know, big noisy symphony, yes. So I think that's
Okay.
where the suspense element comes in for me.
So a bunch of questions again. So, you know, you talked about you flew to a volcano in Argentina, I believe you said, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
Chile, close enough.
for these books, obviously, you know, maybe some of your homesteading experience comes into play, but what kind of research did you have to do for both of these books?
Yeah, that's what makes it interesting, you know, because again, like many aspiring writers, you know, I thought, oh, I like to set my books in an exotic location, Antarctica, you know, an erupting volcano in Chile, and not realizing that where I lived for 30 years, the Upper Peninsula, is also an exotic location. Like the Marsh King's Daughter has been translated into 26 languages around the world.
Wow.
And so, you know, people are reading that book and going, ooh, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you know, how exotic. So as
Nice.
far as research is concerned, You know, I lived in the Upper Peninsula. When my husband and I moved to the UP, it was with the idea of feeling closer to nature. And so, you know, we paid attention to the natural world during all those years. So there were so many times in writing both books that I would include a detail about the natural world in the book. And I would think to myself, I never would have found this no matter how much research I did online, because I just know these things.
Sure.
And in fact, The Marsh King's Daughter was reviewed in the New York Times, which, you know, for an author, that's like, kill me now. It can't get better than this.
Right. Exactly.
And the reviewer said that one of the things that makes the book so superb, his words, was the authenticity of the setting. And he said, you can tell when I write about the natural world that the author's knowledge goes deeper than Wikipedia, which, you know, indeed it does. But
So with,
still,
oh, go
you
ahead.
know,
I'm sorry.
that's okay. There are big chunks that I had to research. Like in The Marsh King's Daughter, I mentioned that the family lives off the grid. So of course they hunt and fish. I've never hunted and fished. I've never even touched a gun. So, you know, I had to do some really intense research for that. And I will say, I was quite intimidated at first, because there's a scene where Helena, as a 6-year-old, she shoots her first deer.
Sure.
It's in the winter, you know, because they're not respecting, you know, hunting laws and seasons.
Right.
And I was very intimidated to write that scene, because I could write like walking across the frozen marsh, what it feels like, what it sounds like, a crow cawing, you know, imagining the fish and the frogs sleeping below her feet. But what it felt like to hold a gun and shoot a gun, I did not know.
Right.
So, you know, I go to, I get a lot of my information from discussion forums, because
Oh,
rather than read a book about how to, you know, track or how to, you know, shoot a gun, you can hear people's actual words in discussion forums and get a sense of the reality of it. And so when I did finally get the scene written, I'm very proud of it. It's now one of my favorite scenes. And in fact, a writer who writes what I call boy books, like military, shoot 'em up, that kind of thing. Shortly after The Marsh King's Daughter published, he sent me a message on Facebook. He was reading The Marsh King's Daughter and enjoying it. And he said, I don't usually tell people this, but I've been an avid hunter my whole life. And he said, when I read the scenes where Helena was learning to track and where she shoots her first deer, he said, I knew you were a hunter too.
nice. Very nice.
So that really makes me smile. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. And so I
Yeah.
got to ask a question. So, uh, a bunch of them. Um, with the research in psychological suspense, are there authors that you read or have read in the last few years that you try to pattern off of? And who are you typically reading and you know in your daily read? And do you read on a regular basis?
Well, I do read a lot. An author, once they're published, they're asked to read and endorse and blurb novels a lot. And
Right.
so, believe it or not, our personal choice reading time narrows drastically between writing our next book and then that situation. So, in my case, when I have a choice of books, I like to read outside my genre. I like to read books that have been won or nominated major prizes like the National Book Award or you know, Pulitzers, and because I call it reading up.
Hmm.
Not, you know, not that there's anything wrong with genre writing, but I want to read books that inspire me to become a better writer. And there's a reason that these books won awards. I look at the list of the Michigan notable books, because, you know, that's basically a curated list, right? You know,
Mhm.
a group of people have looked at all these various books, you
Yep.
know, that have a Michigan connection, and said, you know, these are the best books this year. So that's what I do for my own personal reading.
Oh, fantastic. So, you know, I got a question. You talked about setting, and I usually ask questions about setting. You've already, you know, gone to the UP. I have to ask, when you went to the publisher and you got this two-book deal with Putnam, I believe you said,
Yes.
I, was it a hard sell? Was the UP a hard sell to Putnam originally before? I mean, you know, was it? I mean, did they say,
No,
you know, don't, oh no, it can't be the UP. Nobody knows the UP. And I'm just guessing. And I just, you know, I'm just, yeah, I just wanted,
no, it was actually the exact opposite. So, my agent sent the manuscript when I finished it. To on a Monday, he sent it to 36 editors to see if anyone wanted to publish it. By Tuesday morning, he had heard back from 29 of them. Wednesday, we had our first offer, which we turned down, and there more offers came in. And so a week later, the Marsh King's Daughter sold to Putnam at auction. There were actually 12 publishers who bid on the book.
You go into more detail about your literary agent. I mean, this is something I don't talk about with a lot of people, but I mean, the Marsh King's Daughter, I didn't realize there had been such a quote unquote feeding frenzy for this book. So, I mean, how did that even work? That's a part of the process I've never heard about or even really even
Yeah.
contemplated before.
Well, what happened to me is sort of every author's dream. It's very rare. It's not the common situation, but it's what agents hope will happen, right?
Right.
So my literary agent sent the manuscript for The Marsh King's Daughter to 36 editors on a Monday to see if anyone wanted to publish it. And by Tuesday morning, he had heard back from 29 of them.
Wow.
And we had our first offer for the book the next day. We turned it down. More offers came in. My agent set up an auction for the next week. And the next week, The Marsh King's Daughter sold in a 12-way auction. I mean, 12 publishers wanted to publish the book.
Right.
So that was pretty exciting times. And meanwhile, in that week, my agent was setting up phone calls with me with editors, to see if we clicked, because it isn't just about the money, it's about the person you're going to be working with and, developing a relationship with. And many of the editors told me, like, they had high praise for the book. They said, this is why I'm in this business, finding a book like this. It's so thrilling, so exciting. And the thing is that most people don't maybe know about the business is it's not just one person's decision to make an offer on a book. Many people at the publisher have to read it. The marketing, the sales, and maybe the head publisher, they all read the book in this very short window of time, knowing that others are doing the same thing at other publishing houses. So and then, they get the go ahead to make an offer. So it's just pretty astonishing how that business side of it works. And I should add that when The Marsh King's Daughter sold at that 12-way auction, that was just for US rights. Immediately after, the book sold in a 7-way auction in the UK, a 5-way auction in Germany, a 3-way auction in Korea, for a record amount in Poland. So it was a very heady time for all these publishers around the world who are just jumping on the book set in Michigan's Upper Peninsula to bring it to their readers too.
I gotta ask, I mean, like you say heady, but I would think almost vulnerable too. I mean, I would just, to be honest with you, I would be scared, and I don't know about other people, but I mean, did you feel vulnerable when you talk about, because it almost feels like you make it sound like with all the multiple people at the publisher, like a job interview. I mean,
No, it was more like them trying to sell me on picking them. It was like being the prettiest girl at the dance,
Oh, nice. All right. So much better. All right.
Yeah. So that was good.
Fantastic. So how often do you find yourself writing? I mean, do you find yourself every day sitting down for an hour, 4 hours, 15
I
minutes?
write full time now. The Marsh King's Daughter just literally, changed my life as far as that's concerned, and enabled me to, my husband was able to retire, and my best writing time is early morning. So I'm generally at my desk by 5 or 6 in the morning,
Okay.
writing, and I do peck away at it all day long, but there are a lot of business related things too for a full-time writer, answering emails and writing auxiliary pieces, for magazines about, how you got the idea for the book, interview questions, whatever. So I do that in the afternoon. And I recently moved to a rural area in the middle of Michigan. So now I spend a lot of time outside enjoying nature. And technically I can say, because my books are set in the natural world still, even the one I'm working on is also set in the Upper Peninsula.
Right.
I could say I'm doing research, but I'm really not. It's just being outside, enjoying wildlife, the beauty of the natural world.
Well, that's fantastic. So when you talk about writing, obviously it's not all just, putting pen to paper. I mean, so what about the editing process and how often do you go back and change things? And, I mean, are you constantly editing your pieces, and are there people reading your pieces as time goes on?
Yeah, it evolves. I think when I was a newer writer, I was desperate and hungry for feedback. And I probably bored my family to tears, telling them about the beautiful sentences I wrote that day, or
Right.
wanting to know how was I going to handle this particular plot point and looking for suggestions. But as a writer progresses, you become more confident in your own writing. And so, you don't need that feedback all the time. My literary agent is my first and best reader. He's a very good editor. He has a really good sense of what works in a book and what doesn't, and he's given me some fantastic suggestions along the way. But the book I'm working on now, I'm going to present to him fully finished, so that's going to be a first for us in that regard too. He
Oh,
knows what the idea is, but I'm just working on it myself.
and obviously, I mean, you guys must have an amount of trust now. I mean, how long has he been your agent now? 4 or 5 years?
No, 21, 22 years. Yeah,
Oh,
long
wow.
time.
Okay. All right.
Mhm.
Okay. So right from the beginning then.
Yes, longer than some marriages.
Many marriages. So let
Yeah.
me ask you, so Wicked Sister, tell us about Wicked Sister. What do you want our readers to know or our viewers to know about this book?
Yeah, well, so there are two main things that I'm exploring in The Wicked Sister, and one I've already touched on, the idea that Rachel accidentally shot her parents. To me, there's so many accidental shootings, and especially shootings by children who don't know better. That's so tragic. And when I read about them, I think to myself, what would it be like for that person when they grow up? Maybe they were a toddler when they killed a family member, and at some point they'll find out, and how will that change them as a person?
Right.
You would grow up thinking, oh, I'm a good person, I wouldn't hurt anybody, and then you find out, well, yeah, there's this horrible thing in your past. So that's one question I wanted to work with in The Wicked Sister. And then the other is, obviously by the title you know that there's a wicked sister, right?
Mhm.
So what I'm working with in the story set in the past, which is told by Jenny's mother in the first person, which I think is interesting because the reader knows from the outset that she died a tragic death, so she's not still present. Um, so her story focuses on the idea of someone who has a difficult child. Not every children are born with behavioral disorders. Some, and they show themselves from an early age on. And so for me, the central question in that part, Jenny's part of the story, is number one, how do you deal with that? Because you love your child, any parent wants what's best for their child, but
Sure.
your child is maybe shows violent tendencies, towards their siblings. So at what point do you say, this isn't working, we have to send this child away? I can't, as a mother, I can't imagine doing that.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the question in The Wicked Sister for Jenny, the story set in the past. When does this behavioral issue become too much?
Okay. Okay. So let me ask you, with Michigan, when you talk about your next book that's going to be fully formed, I mean, in your mind, do you see all your books being set in Michigan from now on? Do you think it's, an integral part of your storytelling, or, just for this chapter? Your
I
thought?
it's so interesting, that question, because at this point, yes, I will continue to set my books in Michigan. I love Michigan. I especially love the Upper Peninsula.
Sure.
And I'm not done mining that territory, so to speak. I'm fascinated, like, okay, so the Marsh King's Daughter takes place in the marsh swamp wetland. The
Right.
Wicked Sister takes place in the forest. The
Hmm.
book I'm writing now, the main setting is going to be Lake Superior. It takes place
Nice.
at Grand Marais. And
Okay.
I want to be able to bring Lake Superior to life for readers in other parts of the world who've never seen this amazing lake. That's my goal with this book. But I'm also fascinated by a lot of Michigan's history, like the logging days. When we lived in the Upper Peninsula, I met a man who, I guess he was in his 40s or 50s when I met him, and he grew up in a logging camp. And
Wow.
he never went to school, and there weren't other children to play with. I think his mom was the cook. I would love to work with some of those things even from the past. I would still stick with psychological suspense because that seems to be my thing. But yeah, I think there's a lot to explore still in Michigan. the
Oh,
Michigan
that's
setting.
really, I mean, honestly, logging camps. I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin and we learned about logging camps. I mean, they were fascinating, just
Yeah.
fascinating places to learn about. And then I have to ask, just being a lover of Lake Michigan, would you ever set one on the South Shore of the Upper Peninsula at all, you think? Or is
You
that the
know,
boring side?
I won't say it's beautiful. Of course, it's beautiful, but I do like the wildness. When I was researching the Marsh King's Daughter, I found out that the Upper Peninsula has 29% of the land area of the state of Michigan
Sure.
and 3% of the population, and
Mhm.
that's what I love. I was on book tour for the Marsh King's Daughter paperback, and I went to some cities and libraries in the Upper Peninsula, but also in the Traverse City area. And it was beautiful in Traverse City, but you look out over the bay and there's all these boats and sailboats. And if I go up to the Keweenaw and I look out over the Lake Superior and I see nothing, that's that's what I love.
Okay. Okay. So, just to follow up then, I mean, uh, where do you find inspiration for your books? Is it just that they just pop into your head? Do you just, I mean, you talk about historical, uh, how do you know, other than waking up from a dream, this is a good idea for a book?
Yeah. Well, this is kind of the secret of being a writer. You get to pick your topics. You get to pick something that interests you or fascinates you. Maybe you just read a tiny article in the newspaper. In my case, in the book that I'm currently writing, and I read an article in the New York Times about a woman who was petitioning, well, sort of like Britney Spears, to get her life back.
Mhm.
She had become a ward of the state, and someone else was in control of all of her finances and so forth, and so that fascinated me. And I just bookmarked that article, for
Wow.
a future book because it's a topic that interests me. And so, unlike, a person that goes to school for writing, which I did not do, where you have to read the books that you're assigned, uh, a writer can write the books they choose. So it's kind of a nice arrangement.
So other than history in Michigan, in the current world situation today, is there anything that, you draw influence from right now in our current situation as a country or in the world as a whole?
Well, that's interesting because obviously everybody's been through a really rough year. And when the pandemic first hit a year ago, I couldn't write for a long time. It felt like making up stories about bad things happening to people was so insignificant compared to what was happening in the real world, right?
Sure.
Terrible things were really happening to people.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I really struggled to produce anything during that time. Interestingly, what got me out of that funk was read a book that I had been sent to read with a view to offering an endorsement. I got completely caught up in it. And by the time I finished, I was like, yes, that's what fiction can do. It can take you away from the moment and, put you in another place, another world. And so that I think I've lost a little bit of the thread of what you asked, but to me, that's what, gives value to what I do. And so that's what I hope, that my books will help people to, run away from their troubles, if only briefly.
No, you didn't lose the thread at all. You answered it beautifully. So, uh, you know, for The Wicked Sister, what is your favorite aspects of this book? Characters, pieces, chapters? What do you think is
I love the story set in the past. I love Jenny's story.
okay?
And the reason I guess is because I'm a mother, and that most resonates with me. And it's kind of funny because it's set in the past. I don't know exactly what year, but if Rachel in the present day part of the story is 25 years old, then the story is set like in the 90s, let's say.
Okay.
But my editor had to call me out on it because I had so many references like to as if it was the present day. And I think it's because I got so caught up in writing um, the mother's part of the story, Jenny's part of the story. I forgot this was supposed to be set in the 90s. So that is the part I think that most resonates with me.
Okay, and I am coming to the end of the questions, but there's one that keeps and it's going to hound me. You're an international bestseller now. Your book has been published in all these countries, and I am fascinated. do you get questions about Michigan and the Great Lakes? Because I do know that people who come to the Great Lakes for the first time, they never are prepared for the expanse of the Great Lakes. Do you get questions about, I don't even know what the questions would be, but do
Yeah.
you get questions from foreign readers about that?
Well, I get questions, not so much questions as comments from readers in other parts of the world about how it sounds so beautiful and they want to go there.
Oh, nice.
And if you even have planned trips to the Upper Peninsula as a result of reading my novels, which is pretty mind-boggling to think that I brought it to life to that extent. But I think the thing about fiction is you're creating that world as if it was real.
Sure.
So I do feel like my setting is accurate. But if this were science fiction and it was set in space and another planet, that within the context of that book, the author's job is to make that world seem real. So there is that aspect. Uh, when you write a book, when you set it, you have to convey it as if it was real. I've got the advantage because I lived in the Upper Peninsula for 30 years, so
Yeah,
it's easy for me.
fantastic. And
Yeah.
so what does it mean for you? You lived in the UP, now you're living in Central Michigan. What does it mean for you to be selected as a Michigan Notable Book Author?
Oh, it means so much. I can't begin to tell you because, yes, my books have been bestsellers in other parts of the world, but we know that there are bestsellers that aren't particularly well written, right? They're bestsellers for other reasons.
Sure.
And so, to have the quality of the book recognized by the Library of Michigan, and I know that the committee is very discerning. It just means so much to me to have had both my psychological suspense selected as Michigan Notable Books, and now it sets a challenge for the next book. Have to write it, do a good job with it.
Fantastic. So, well, thank you so much for being with us today, Karen. Do you have anything else you'd like to add today?
Well, just one other aspect of some of the cool things that have happened for the Marsh King's Daughter.
Yeah,
Right now, it's being filmed as a major motion picture.
fantastic.
Yeah, the production companies who are making the movie are responsible for movies like The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch and Spotlight and The Revenant. The star is Daisy Ridley. She was Rey in the Star Wars movies.
Sure.
And, it's just this massive, massive undertaking. They're filming in Canada.
I was going to ask, where are they filming? I was going to
I
say,
know, I know. So many readers ask me, why not film it in the Upper Peninsula? And I'm sure there are many, many practical considerations. I'm getting
are
a
they at
sense.
least filming in Ontario on the Great
Yes,
Lake?
in Ontario. But the
Okay.
producers assured me they very much, the movie will be set as if it was in the Upper Peninsula, and they really wanted to get the feel of the natural world as much as possible. I've seen a few pictures from the set, and it's going to be a gorgeous film. But they're filming in a place, a river, where it entails a 20-minute boat ride for cast, crew, equipment. The director of photography posted a picture on Instagram stories, a video of a helicopter lowering equipment down to the set. So, they're really going through a big effort to make it look like the Upper Peninsula.
So I got to
Upper
ask,
Peninsula on steroids, I guess.
is it at least on Lake Superior or is it?
Well, there's no Lake Superior in the Marsh
I'm
King's
sorry.
Daughter, but
Okay, so
yeah, but there will be a waterfall. And I will
I'm
say this
thinking,
too.
okay.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm learning, a lot about the movie making process. I now understand why a movie says based on the novel by so and so, because it's not a recreation of my novel on the screen. It's an interpretation of my novel on the screen. So, there are a lot of changes in the story. I really, really like the script. But of course, as an author, you know how people always say, oh, the book was so much better than the movie. Yes, I hope that's the case.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being with us today. And tell us all, just, I mean, if you're willing, what library at, because we always like to plug libraries in the state.
Oh, well, okay. So I'm outside the Sherman Township Library Zooming. And the reason I'm here is because in moving to a rural area, I don't get good internet at my house. And, so the library, not only do they have books and DVDs to rent or borrow inside, they also let me use their wonderful free high-speed internet. So yay for the Sherman Township Library.
And you are not the first author to do that. So I
Oh,
can
that's good to know.
always a good plug for our libraries. But Karen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a lot of fun.
And to all of you, thank you for viewing. Again, we're here with Karen Dionne and her book, The Wicked Sister, winner of the Michigan Notable Book 2021 award. And she also was the previous winner for the Marsh King's Daughter. And I just have to ask one thing, when are they expecting the movie to premiere?
Well, I have not been told. I saw an article where someone, I guess it typically takes a year, but this person speculated that because The Marsh King's Daughter was a best-selling novel and because of the actors that are attached, that they might be hoping for awards. So apparently, if they want to position the movie for awards, it would be a December 2020 or January 2023 release. So
oh, good luck.
Sounds like a long way off, but fortunately there are lots of good books to read in the meanwhile, right?
Yes, exactly. So Karen, thank you so much for being with us today and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Tim.